Ian Gloucester longed to be reborn, yet the simple words of a man dissatisfied with his life were not enough. Once, he had fervently wished for those words to come true. From early childhood, the boy had been tormented and mocked by his peers. They gave him no peace, and wherever he went, he was driven away. His body bore numerous bruises and wounds, which never had time to heal. And so, during yet another walk, Ian Gloucester was once again beaten, laughed at, and ridiculed. The boys had the audacity to call him a cursed child, abandoned by his own parents. The boy could no longer hear their jeers, for in that moment he raised his fist, ready to strike his tormentor. A spark flickered in the air, signaling that his barely controlled magic was on the verge of bursting forth. Unfortunately, it all ended with Ian Gloucester injuring one of the boys, for which he was now being chastised by the priest. He had once promised the man that it would never happen again, but it was difficult to restrain himself. The boy began to protest, saying the bullies were the ones who started it, but the priest dismissed his words as a mere excuse. Ian Gloucester, of course, resented having to endure constant mockery directed at him. Sitting beside him, the man sighed and reminded him that he was no ordinary child. The priest was right, explaining that sooner or later Ian Gloucester would need the help of friends, and he must think wisely now. Yet Ian Gloucester could not bring himself to believe it, when suddenly there was a knock at the door, summoning the priest for a private conversation about what had happened. Sensing a disturbance, he rose and asked the boy to wait for him there. It turned out that the bully's father had come in person to settle the matter. Naturally, Ian Gloucester did not remain seated, and so he overheard everything being said behind the door, peeking through a thin crack. According to the angry man, a priest had recently come to bless the village, but it was all in vain, for the boy brought harm to everything he touched. Matters had escalated to the point where he had contacted the central diocese, and soon a cardinal would arrive. The man demanded that the priest tell the cardinal everything about Ian Gloucester, so he would understand the suffering the village endured because of him. Wherever this child went, whatever he looked at or touched, things would begin to break, harm others, or stir up anger. Once, an enraged woman had called him a monster and demanded he disappear, and those words had lodged deeply in the boy's mind. Before leaving, the man warned the priest that they must get rid of Ian Gloucester, or else the church could forget about donations. To him, it was akin to pouring water into a bottomless pit, and so he allowed a little time for reflection. Ian Gloucester's desire to be reborn was strong. Perhaps he had already been reborn into a monster. He had no choice but to endure this dreadful life, tormented by thoughts of what he had done to deserve it. One day, it became too much for the young man to bear, and he resolved to make all those who had ever looked at him with scorn pay the price. The terrible dream that haunted Ian Gloucester nearly every night was interrupted by an aggressive knock at the door. Standing on the threshold was Russell Brixton, the deputy captain of Derwin's Knights, displeased to find the young man still asleep. Ian Gloucester grumbled and reluctantly sat up, attempting to rouse himself as the man entered, folding his arms across his chest. Today, the protagonist had a scheduled meeting with Marquis Gartel, as Russell Brixton tactfully reminded him. The Marquis had sent a report expressing his fear that King Archaea was preparing for war, and unfortunately, the Cardinal shared his concerns. Russell Brixton suggested that Ian Gloucester, too, ought to be worried, or more precisely, should investigate the matter thoroughly. In a foul mood, the young man told him to leave him alone, a response that did little to impress the knight. Grabbing him by the shirt, Russell Brixton declared that he knew what Ian Gloucester was doing behind the Cardinal's back, and urged him to get a grip so as not to cause trouble for the Cardinal. With that, the tense conversation ended, and the man left the room, slamming the door for emphasis. Ian Gloucester watched him go, then turned away, cursing the man silently in his thoughts. Once, the world had been plunged into chaos by a war between Derwin and Archaea, but after a peace treaty was signed 20 years ago, life had begun to return to normal. So Light Winkler, a descendant of dragons, had founded the kingdom of Archaea and still ruled it to this day. Though considered a wise ruler, he had been a fierce warrior in the war, slaughtering countless foes. Thus, people trembled at the reminders of that conflict, as rumors of a new war began to circulate among the populace. The rumors had been spread to extract more money from the people, and Ian Gloucester was once again reminded that someone like Solite Winkler was truly worthy of death. At the meeting, Marquis Gartel was overly courteous, giving the impression that he had some hidden agenda. However, Ian Gloucester was no fool. He played along, intending to glean as much information as possible. The young man assured the Marquis that their meeting was merely a consultation regarding the impending war. The people were deeply anxious about the approaching conflict, and without divine assistance, their faith would falter, or so Gartel claimed. All he needed was for Ian Gloucester to speak with the cardinal, implying that someone was once again trying to usurp God's place. The Marquis was certain that His Eminence would be willing to direct additional funds to the people. Suddenly, Ian Gloucester asked the Marquis if he truly believed that the ruler was preparing for war. Gartel evaded the question, saying only that in times of danger, everyone must prioritize their own safety. In such times, it was essential to adapt to the people's mood, and as for the war, no one really cared about it. As he listened, Ian Gloucester kept his gaze fixed on the doors guarded by the Marquis's attendant. Waiting for the right moment, he invited the Marquis to come closer, and the man leaned in without hesitation. Whispering something about siphoning money from the people, Ian Gloucester pressed a knife to his throat, slashing the delicate skin without hesitation. The guard cried out and rushed to aid the Marquis, only to be struck down a moment later. Ian Gloucester allowed the man to keep his honor. He would die with the story that he had uncovered Gartel's collusion with Archaea to start a war and perished trying to stop him. Yet the protagonist wondered how much honor meant to someone who was already dead. Leaving an envelope with a letter on the table, Ian Gloucester addressed the dead Marquis, remarking that greed ought to have its limits. In life, Gartel had found high taxes insufficient. Moreover, he had even trafficked in human lives, so the young man had decided to eliminate him, making it look like an unfortunate accident. Exiting the room, Ian Gloucester donned a carefully prepared cloak and was ready to leave the palace. By his request, all rumors had been spread in advance, leaving the corridors completely empty. He had fabricated evidence ahead of time, so even if the servants found them, it would appear as though Gartel had conspired with Archaea. Everything had gone perfectly, save for one small, unexpected detail. A blonde stranger suddenly appeared in the doorway, blocking his path. Both young men were startled by each other's presence. One, because he was certain everyone had been dismissed, and the other, because he hadn't expected to encounter anyone while sneaking in. Ian Gloucester swung his blade instantly, unwilling to leave alive anyone who had seen his face that night. The stranger, however, turned out to be Solite Winkler, who swiftly deflected the attack, knocking the weapon from Ian's hand with ease. The blade flew up, leaving Ian defenseless, a realization that filled him with genuine fear, his eyes widening in shock. The blond man took a stance and reached out, aiming to seize Ian Gloucester by the throat, but the young man's power would not allow it. Solite's hand froze mere inches from his skin as sparks began to flicker in the air around them. In a flash, an explosion erupted, sending Solite Winkler hurtling backward, slamming painfully against the windows. Ian Gloucester took a step forward, intending to approach the man, but halted in the doorway, watching from a distance to assess his condition. The stranger's head was drenched in blood, his body limp as though signaling he was dead. The protagonist felt a jolt of fear. He hadn't intended to unleash such force, but at least now there would be no living witnesses. Fleeing the palace, Ian Gloucester sprinted through the dark alleys of the city, hoping no one had seen him. Stopping at the corner of a building, he braced himself against the wall, catching his breath, when suddenly a pendant slipped treacherously from beneath his clothes. Clutching it tightly in his hand, he panicked again, wondering how the power he had once sealed away had managed to break free. Shaking his head, Ian Gloucester tried to reassure himself that everyone was dead and no one had seen anything. Taking one last deep breath, he pulled his hood over his head and walked calmly through the streets, unaware that this was only the beginning of his troubles. In the palace corridors, a dead silence lingered, until it was broken by a loud cough, as Solite Winkler suddenly regained consciousness, clutching his head. A flicker of healing magic glowed in his hand, and soon his wounds vanished, leaving not a scratch, let alone any blood. Leaning against the window, the blond man laughed at himself for having momentarily let his guard down, and even fainting of all things. His mind unexpectedly drifted to a recent conversation with Prime Minister Sienna Delavigne, who had spoken of rumors that had grown increasingly persistent. Someone was undoubtedly behind the spread of these rumors, and with the ruler recruiting new knights, the tales gained strength with each passing day. There had been no official statement, and with Solite Winkler's frequent absences, such rumors were bound to arise. The Prime Minister, troubled by the ruler's actions, had decided to check if he was landing himself in any difficulties. Solid had confidently replied that he had taught a few lessons to those who obstructed him, but they had all been left alive. Sienna Delavine had clutched his head in exasperation, exclaiming that he couldn't understand how long this chase of Solite Winklers would continue. The ruler had remained silent, prompting the Prime Minister to warn him that the spread of bad rumors about Archaea was undesirable and needed to be dealt with. Rising from his seat with a smile, Solite had declared that from that moment onward, he would personally investigate the matter, and he intended to find out everything firsthand. Sienna Delavagna nearly howled in frustration, insisting that the ruler couldn't be absent all the time and should send someone else instead. Solite Winkler had merely smirked, saying that a life without adventure was no life at all. By mid-afternoon, he had arrived in the city, listening one last time to his coachman's advice to be cautious and to keep his origins from Archaea a secret, lest there be trouble. The blond man had simply waved off the warning, indicating there was nothing to worry about, though he was then urged not to be so carefree and to return safely. As soon as the carriage departed, Solite Winkler removed his hood, glancing around with curiosity, wondering when the city had become so hostile. By evening, he found himself in a local tavern, surrounded by the town's drunken regulars. One of them was babbling nonsense about Archaea, claiming that they were seeking divine favor and that they must all be prepared for it. Listening to this, Solita Winkler thought of Marquis Gartel, the lord of these lands. The Marquis had done nothing to quell the rumors on his territory, which meant they served his interests. Just as he was about to leave the bar, Solita Winkler overheard the drunkard speaking about the king of Archaea and the demonic power he unleashed on the battlefield. The man insisted that the ruler of Archaea cared nothing for peace treaties, and most of those present agreed. It was nearing midnight, and the drunkard was finally thrown out of the bar, stumbling unsteadily down the street. Suddenly, his path was blocked by Solite Winkler, who asked directly how much he was being paid to spread these rumors. Naturally, the man didn't understand what was being asked, and feeling threatened, he swung the bottle he had been holding tightly in his hand. The blond man, unwilling to tolerate such insolence, used his power. The bottle shattered instantly, scattering into tiny shards. The shards sliced across the drunkard's face, leaving a multitude of small cuts. He was terrified and collapsed to the ground, trembling and nearly in tears. Swearing, the man tried to shout at Solite Winkler, but Solite grabbed him by the face, asking again how much he was being paid. If they had met on the battlefield, the drunkard would have lost more than an eye, so Solite was curious where he had seen him to spread such rumors with such confidence. Solite Winkler promised to let the man go if he revealed who had ordered him. The answer came quickly. The man responsible was Marquis Gartel, and soon Solite was at the palace, pondering how to gain entry. Since it was the Marquis who spread the rumors, everything had changed, and Solite Winkler was intent on having a personal conversation with him. As Gartel was the main instigator of the rumors, there was nothing criminal in him sneaking into his estate. Yet, in the end, things had turned out in a way he never could have expected. Ian Gloucester's power had felt weak, as though something was holding it back. But he understood everything now. It was mana that had failed to take the form of magic. But what puzzled Solite Winkler most was that the young man wore the uniform of Archaea. He realized that Ian Gloucester had intended to frame it as though a knight of Archaea had murdered Marquis Gartel. But now, one question haunted him. Where could he find this young man? The next morning, the protagonist awoke as he always did. Russell Brixton burst into the room, rousing him abruptly. Russell was curious about what Ian Gloucester had discussed with Marquis Gartel and urged him to hurry up with his explanation. Ian had no choice but to agree, recount his story, and then prepare to head straight to the Cardinal to relay the same account. Pausing at the door, he adjusted his collar and took a deep breath, announcing his arrival. Entering the room, he saw the Cardinal at the altar, blessing the newborn child of a young couple. The woman thanked Heron Brixton, and she and her husband departed, leaving the two of them to speak in private. The blond man greeted Ian Gloucester with a warm smile, asking him the usual questions about his well-being. As Ian approached, the Cardinal handed him a letter from Marquis Gartel, which had arrived that very morning. Ian's expression shifted dramatically. He froze in horror as Heron Brixton broke the seal, preparing to read it aloud. Seeing the confusion on his face, the Cardinal asked what was wrong, and Ian, like a practiced actor, replied that he hadn't expected the Marquis to send a letter. In his view, Gartel had always been an anxious man, and he hadn't thought such a simple consultation would reassure him. But in truth, the Marquis was dead, and Ian doubted that a man like him would ever write about working for the public good. Ian recalled his encounter with the stranger, but he was certain that man was dead as well. After a pause, he turned to Heron Brixton, asking to be blessed again, which elicited visible surprise. It had been less than 2 weeks since his last blessing, prompting the cardinal to wonder if the pendant had lost its effectiveness. Fortunately, the pendant was intact, though Ian Gloucester himself was clearly troubled, something Heron Brixton noticed immediately. Leaning toward him, the cardinal urged him to remain vigilant and added that he was proud of him. At first stunned, Ian then leaned into the outstretched hand, exhaling in relief. He too took pride in being his knight. Heron Brixton had accepted him, the little monster, when it seemed the whole world had turned its back on the boy. The cardinal had been genuinely concerned for young Ian Gloucester's feelings, trying to help him as he endlessly blamed himself. Heron Brixton was one of the few who dared approach the boy, wipe away his tears, and ask if he was still frightened. He reassured Ian that he was now safe, but Ian couldn't believe it, convinced his curse brought only harm. Thankfully, Heron was persuasive, speaking of God, his guidance, and the belief that together they could overcome anything. And so, in time, young Ian Gloucester found he could walk among people without bringing misfortune. One day, Heron Brixton gifted him a pendant, instructing him to wear it always, as it would shield him from his destructive powers. Now, as a knight, Ian Gloucester reminded himself that he must become a worthy aid to Lord Heron Brixton, no matter the cost. The protagonist was determined to visit the Marquis's estate and uncover what had truly happened. Upon arrival, he found the servants working as usual, carrying out their routines as if their master were indeed alive. Ian could hardly believe they still didn't know their lord was dead, and if that was the case, he would have to confirm it himself. Finding a servant's uniform, or rather stealing it from one of them, he made his way to the Marquis's bedchamber. Knocking on the door, he expected to hear permission to enter or something of the sort, but instead, he was abruptly yanked inside by the arm. The sight of Solit Winkler before him was utterly unexpected, leaving Ian Gloucester frozen in bewilderment, pinned against the door. Ian Gloucester's pupils contracted in horror, for he distinctly remembered finding the man's body lifeless. Magic began to crackle treacherously in the air, but Solit Winkler seemed to ignore it, calmly stating that they had matters to discuss. Ian Gloucester, not at all pleased with the situation, suggested they change their positions, but the blonde was too cunning. He knew the boy would attack the moment he was free. Solit had set a trap and waited for Ian to fall into it, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that he was dealing with someone far more capable than he expected. A few swift movements, a deft hold, and now Solit Winkler was on the floor, pinned down, Ian's fingers locked tightly around his throat, preventing him from drawing a full breath. The young man grimly warned that he had no intention of doing as this stranger wished, then pressed his boot down hard on Solit's wrist. Grimacing, then smirking, the man agreed to have the conversation from this position if that's what Ian Gloucester preferred. Without hesitation, Solit Winkler declared that he needed someone capable of helping him, and that someone was Ian Gloucester. As it turned out, it was Solit himself who had sent the letter in the Marquis's name and even resurrected him. He would wake up eventually. The blond man explained that he couldn't let someone who might be useful to him die. And now, based on Ian's answer, he would either forget him or keep everything a secret. Ian Gloucester had no intention of considering the second option and warned Solit Winkler that if he thought threats would work, he was mistaken. At this, the blond man merely smirked, taking advantage of Ian's momentary confusion to skillfully reverse their positions. Realizing they wouldn't be able to resolve this peacefully, Solit decided to take extreme measures. A sudden spark of magic flared in his hand. Seeing it, Ian Gloucester panicked. The magic was identical to his own. But before he could utter a word, heavy shackles snapped onto his wrists and Solit's as well, linking them together with a chain. Meanwhile, the cardinal was enjoying a light-hearted conversation with the knights, chatting about everything and nothing at all. Russell Brixton was displeased that Heron Brixton continually let Ian Gloucester off the hook, and the young knight beside him had also heard tales of how Heron Brixton, when he was head of the knights, had once been exceptionally strict. Outwardly, he seemed very friendly, but when someone broke the rules, he could be terrifying. The blonde cardinal didn't give a direct response, only reminded them that they all served God and were obligated to treat their duties with utmost seriousness. Russell Brixton brought up Ian Gloucester again, asking why he was treated so leniently, since special treatment could disrupt the unity of the knightly order. Heron Brixton laughed it off, joking that Ian looked rather charming when he was late in the mornings. This answer didn't sit well with the captain, as it seemed the cardinal was treating Ian as though he were his own child, which was far from the truth. However, he chose not to argue, and soon all three found themselves in the cardinal's study, helping him carry a few books. Before leaving, Russell Brixton warned that if Ian Gloucester were late to evening prayers, he would have no choice but to take action. Fortunately or unfortunately, Ian only obeyed Heron Brixton, so the cardinal asked Russell to keep an eye on him and to scold him if necessary. The cardinal thanked the knights for their efforts in maintaining order and finally dismissed them. As soon as they disappeared behind the door, the smile fell from Heron Brixton's face. He recalled how oddly Ian Gloucester had behaved that morning. But for now, as long as the boy was within his sight, he allowed him his small rebellions. At Marquis Gartel's estate, everything was running more smoothly than ever. Or at least it appeared so now, as Solite Winkler and Ian Gloucester sat down at a so-called negotiating table. Solite proved to be a skilled talker and liar, a fact the protagonist suspected but hadn't fully realized. Ian could see that this man wielded real power, and he guessed that Solite must be a nobleman from the western reaches of Archaea. Given that the servants recognized Solite Winkler on sight, he could easily pretend that nothing unusual had happened the night before, simply claiming he'd spent the whole night in business discussions with the Marquise. The blonde man offered Ian Gloucester a deal, convinced that Ian might know what was truly at play and who was stoking the fires that threatened to lead to war. Exhausted from the long negotiations, Ian realized he would have to take action based on the reasons Solite had laid out. Yet, on the other hand, this man knew something about his powers, so Ian Gloucester requested a day to think it over. Solite Winkler agreed to give him a bit of time, but when Ian asked to have the shackles removed, he simply shook his head. The stranger's trust was no concern of Ian's, yet he couldn't exactly walk around openly wearing chains and defend himself from attacks. Solite smirked, calling his powers cursed, causing Ian to freeze. Then he followed up by asking if Ian truly thought he was cursed. Solite could see that this wasn't the case and was quite certain that Ian felt the same, so he left the shackles in place but removed their visible form. As long as they were bound, Solite could track him wherever he went, and he warned Ian that thoughts of escape would be futile. All Ian asked in return was that Solite honor his promise. Then he departed from the Marquise's estate. Walking through the city streets, Ian Gloucester glanced at his wrist, pondering how the binding would prevent him from straying too far from Solite Winkler. Suddenly, he was distracted by the sound of church bells, signaling the start of evening service. Quickening his pace, the protagonist headed straight for the church, already anticipating how displeased Russell Brixton would be to see him arriving late yet again. Meanwhile, Solite Winkler was preoccupied with thoughts of Ian's pendant and how exactly it managed to restrain his magic. Realizing that he couldn't sit idly by, he decided to take matters into his own hands and investigate further. While changing in his room, Ian Gloucester found a note on his table, briefly informing him that Russell Brixton was furious. Clenching it in his fist, he muttered to himself, wondering when the captain wasn't furious, then left the room and headed to the service. The prayer was already underway, and Ian's sudden arrival barely distracted anyone. Realizing it was best not to go to his usual spot, Ian crept in, finding a seat wherever he could. Unfortunately, he couldn't avoid Russell Brixton's scornful glare. It sent chills down his spine. Finally settling into an open seat, Ian noticed that Heron Brixton was also watching him, smiling all the while. Lowering his gaze, he knew he'd be reprimanded after the service, so he decided not to dwell on it now, focusing instead on the prayer. Yet, as if to spite him, his mind was filled with recent events and what he should do next. Solite Winkler, sitting nearby, remarked aloud that staring at his wrist wouldn't break the shackles, to which Ian automatically replied that he had no intention of breaking anything. Realizing what was happening, Ian suddenly froze, then turned, staring in shock at the blonde man. Solite merely smirked, noting that Ian Gloucester had quite a few identities, and at the moment, he was clearly the knight. Before Ian could respond, Solite clapped a hand over his mouth, ordering him to keep quiet and not reveal himself. Once he was certain Heron Brixton hadn't noticed, Ian pulled back, grumbling irritably about how it hadn't even been a day since Solite had bound them with those shackles. Solite protested that he wasn't spying on Ian, though it was obvious that any excuse he offered would hardly suffice, as the situation spoke for itself. Suddenly, Heron Brixton turned in their direction, and in a panic, Ian shoved Solid's face down onto the table in front of him. The strange sound drew the attention of those nearby, making Ian feel even more self-conscious. Russell Brixton also shot him an angry glare, so Ian quickly apologized, explaining that his friend had suddenly felt unwell. Bending down toward Solid, he theatrically asked him to rest a bit, using a fake name, Jack. Playing along, Solid gracefully slid off the table onto Ian's lap, asking if he could lie there until he felt better. Ian froze in bewilderment, expecting anything but this. Solita, however, seemed more than pleased with the situation, confirming it with a slight smirk. As soon as the service ended, Ian grabbed Solit's hand and hurriedly led him out of the hall before anyone could see them together. Heron Brixton, noticing that Ian was acting even stranger this evening than he had in the morning, grew visibly concerned. He also saw that Ian was leading someone away, which filled him with an uneasy feeling. In the corridor, a young knight tried to approach Ian with a request, but he was tactfully ignored. Once they were in a private room, Ian finally released Solite, leaning against the door. The whole ordeal had frayed his nerves. Besides that, he was furious with the blonde man, and after catching his breath, he seized Solite again, this time by the collar. He demanded to know how a lawbreaker like him even managed to get in here, and told him that a little decency might keep him from showing up where he didn't belong. Solite Winkler, however, merely shrugged, pointing out that if he was a lawbreaker, then so was Ian. They were accomplices, after all. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted their argument. A concerned voice on the other side belonged to the cardinal. Smirking, Solite reached for the door handle, suggesting they surrender together right now if Ian was so unhappy with their little partnership. Ian Gloucester had no idea what Solite Winkler was talking about, but he was certain that the man wasn't foolish enough to actually open the door. Digging his own grave was a terrible idea. Yet Solite had been bold enough to come directly into the church, despite being from Archaea. There was no room for risk, but the man seemed intent on doing the exact opposite, which only made Ian more nervous as he gripped Solite's wrists tightly. He didn't want to disappoint the cardinal, so he practically begged Solite Winkler not to do anything reckless. But the blonde was insistent. In an instant, he pulled Ian close, pushing him away from the door and opening it. Caught off guard, Ian nearly stumbled, and hearing the creak of the door, he panicked, straightening up abruptly and shoving Solite away. Standing in the doorway was a concerned Heron Brixton, who at first seemed at a loss for words as he took in the sight of his flustered knight. The cardinal mentioned that he'd heard a strange noise before the door opened, and he glanced into the room. Fortunately, there was no one inside, only a cloak on the floor and an open window. Realizing what had happened, Ian confidently claimed that he had been alone the entire time and assured the cardinal there was no need for concern, other than his poor health, of course. Heron Brixton had already suspected this, which was why he hadn't scolded Ian for being late to morning prayers. It was painfully obvious to anyone that the young man's hands were trembling and he was drenched in a cold sweat. The cardinal asked Ian to lie down and rest, promising to bring him some warm tea. He decided to postpone their conversation, much to Ian's immense relief. Once the door closed, Ian slumped against it, sliding down to the floor and burying his face in his hands. Solite Winkler, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation the entire time, concluded that Ian Gloucester was deeply concerned with others' opinions. He even seemed to restrain his harsh nature around Heron Brixton, which Solite pointed out with a sly remark. Ian had no kind words for Solite Winkler, but the blonde didn't take offense, reminding him that it was Ian who had dragged him into the room. Solite tried to steer the conversation toward something more to his liking, probing for information about the cardinal. But Ian merely waved him off. He was more concerned with when Solite would finally release him, since he had already agreed to help. But it seemed nothing would be that simple. Eventually, Ian confessed how Heron Brixton had taken him in and given him a new life when everyone else around him had only shown hatred. He remembered how Solite Winkler had insisted he wasn't cursed, yet at the same time, he felt too old to cling to false hopes of a better future. Seeing how despondent Ian had become, Solite stood up and approached him, intending to demonstrate something. But as soon as he used a bit of magic, Ian collapsed from exhaustion. The situation was worse than he had anticipated. It was clear, even to a fool, that Heron Brixton had trained Ian like a dog, and so Solite decided to give him some time to rest. Meanwhile, the cardinal was in his study, sorting through papers, when Russell Brixton entered, asking about the tardy night. Hearing that Ian Gloucester was unwell, the captain was unsurprised and merely grimaced. Heron Brixton, however, was troubled, sensing that the events didn't align with Ian's words. It saddened him to realize the young man was openly lying. To lighten the mood, Russell Brixton brought up the upcoming expedition, where the Cardinal requested both the captain and Ian Gloucester as his escorts. The captain suspected that Heron Brixton was deeply dissatisfied with Ian's excuses and wouldn't let him off the hook this time. The next morning, Russell Brixton came to Ian Gloucester's door, as he always did. Only this time, he didn't expect the door to be locked, just as Ian didn't expect to wake up in bed with Solid Winkler.